I want to return to the topic of George Orwell and talk now about his ethical and political views. They're intimately connected together. He doesn't have anything like an ethical theory, nor does he really have a political theory. But I think if we examine what's going on in 1984, we can see that he does have views about ethics and about politics. They're connected to the overall themes of the book, but they're also connected to one another in an interesting way. So let's begin thinking first about what Orwell says about ethics. The real problem of our time, he says, is to restore the sense of absolute right and wrong when the belief that it used to rest on, that is, the belief in personal immortality, has been destroyed. Orwell thinks of ethics as depending on religion, and he thinks that people have been taught to be ethical essentially for one reason and one reason only, namely that they believe that their souls will actually survive their own deaths and that they'll suffer either the punishments of hell or they will enjoy the rewards of heaven. And so as long as religion is there, people have a motivation to be moral. The question, why be moral, has a determinate answer. God wants you to be moral, and God will reward you for being moral. God will punish you if you aren't. So there's a pretty clear motive. But suppose you lose your belief in religion. Well, then that answer is gone. You're not going to believe any longer that your soul will persist after your own death, or even if you believe that, you're unlikely to think there's anything like a reward or a punishment for anything you do on earth. So what then is the motivation for being moral? And why should you think morality makes any sense at all? Orwell's worried about that question. He looks around himself and sees a lot of people who have lost faith in religion and consequently have lost faith in morality. They've lost any real sense of ethics, of why they should bother to be good, why they should avoid evil. And the result of that, he sees, is the prevalence of evil. So what do we do about that? We have to somehow instill people with a sense of right and wrong, a sense of absolute right and wrong, not one that can bend at their own desires or their own self-interest or any given ideology. How do we do it? Orwell's answer is that we need to remain engaged in the world. He thinks once we examine concrete problems, concrete issues, concrete realities, we're going to be driven to a natural reaction of thinking certain things are good and certain things are bad. We're going to think of certain actions as good and other actions as evil. And so all we really have to do is keep engaged in the world. People who are driven by ideology, he thinks, remove themselves from the concrete realities. They think about the abstractions. They don't think about the concrete individuals that those abstractions affect. And so he says you've got to remain engaged. The essential evil is to think in terms of escape. The fact to which we have got to cling as to a life belt is that it's possible to be a normal, decent person and yet be fully alive. He looks around himself and sees people driven by ideology. People in the Spanish Civil War, for example, on both sides. People who are ardent communists, or people who are ardent fascists, or within the context of World War II, on many different sides, representing ideologies. Ideologies that are evil, not because there's something intrinsically wicked about them, but because they ignore the concrete realities of people's lives. They allow people to ignore the realities in front of them and to discount the value of real human beings. So Orwell says we have to remain engaged. We have to stay in contact with the world and remain decent human beings. It's easier, in a sense, if we're looking at people in the eye as we actually do things that affect them. It's easy in an ivory tower or in a capital far removed from ordinary people's lives to make decisions that affect them and in fact devastate their lives. We've got to stay engaged. We've got to engage with real people in real situations. One of Orwell's main motivations is the problem of poverty. That's what drives his own political views from the outset toward socialism. He thinks that inequality is a problem, but the real problem is what happens on the bottom end of the inequality. Philip Reef describes it this way. Orwell was stricken unto death with the problem of poverty, and he made it the certain and rich theme of his writing. Only those whose souls have been quickened by poverty really experience the world as it is. The experience of poverty is the loss of innocence. falling into poverty burdens one with a problem neither the never poor nor the always poor suffer, quite literally how one ought to live. So many of Orwell's characters experience poverty, experience real material poverty, not just a poverty of the soul, though there's plenty of that as well. But the reality of it is that it forces people to confront the question of how they ought to live, how they need to live, what they have to do in order to survive. And so there is a moral problem that one confronts when one thinks about poverty, not just from the outside looking at poverty as a problem, but from the inside as a poor person thinking, how am I going to live? How can I survive? What can I do to live? What may I do in order to live? There's an aesthetic dimension of this as well. Orwell looks around himself and looks at modern society, modern architecture, modern cities, and finds them pretty awful. He finds himself surrounded by ugliness. And when he writes 1984, he projects that into the future and envisions an ugly world full of ugly structures, people wearing ugly clothing, and actually in 1984, literally ugly people. He sees society devolving into a culture where we're all surrounded by ugliness all of the time. Philip Reef, again, says, Orwell describes the winter of Western civilization. Both worlds are desolate, dank, windless, bleak, colorless, gray. The slummy wilderness of capitalist civilization is succeeded by the slummier wilderness of totalitarianism. It may be surprising that throughout his life, Orwell remained a socialist. After all, in 1984, the main organization is INGSOC, which is short for English Socialism. And indeed, it seems like socialism is really the object of attack in 1984. So how could he remain a socialist? What was that all about? It's an interesting puzzle. He calls himself a democratic socialist. He doesn't think socialism has to become totalitarian. But he does admit that there's a strong tendency within socialism to become that way. After all, socialism is about, as Hayek put it, the conscious centralization of power. It's about the conscious, centralized direction of social forces to consciously chosen ends. And so if centralization is essential to socialism, it's really what it is all about, then how does it avoid becoming totalitarian? Orwell admits there's a strong tendency. He is hopeful that it can be avoided, it can be counteracted in some way. On the other hand, when you read 1984, it's a little bit hard to see exactly how that's possible. How does one safeguard against the tendency of centralization to become the centralization of everything, the centralization of cultural power, political power, economic power, and so on and so forth? How do you avoid having the entire system become totalitarian? It's common for socialists, after all, to win office democratically and then throw the democratic safeguards out once in office because it impedes their effort for centralization. So Orwell doesn't really map out any plan. He doesn't give us, I think, any technique, even any general strategies for trying to avoid this, except to insist on guardrails and insist that decisions have to be made democratically. It's certainly theoretically possible to have a democratic socialism where we centralize decision-making, but then make those decisions democratically. However, it doesn't tend to work out that way in practice, at least for very long. Either socialists get voted out of office, or they stay in power through non-democratic means, and the result of that ends up being a totalitarian government. So how do we avoid that? Well, it's not clear from what Orwell writes. But what he does in 1984 is depict what a totalitarian form of socialism might look like. And it's a frightening prospect. Orwell writes, "It was generally imagined that socialism could preserve and even enlarge the atmosphere of liberalism. It's now beginning to be realized how false this idea was. Almost certainly we're moving into an age of totalitarian dictatorships, an age in which freedom of thought will be at first a deadly sin, and later on a meaningless abstraction. The autonomous individual is going to be stamped out of existence." Various critics have reacted to the portrait in 1984 in different ways. Isaac Deutscher, for example, says that 1984 is a document of dark disillusionment, not only with Stalinism, but with every form and shade of socialism. It's a cry from the abyss of despair. So he sees it as Orwell, in effect, giving up, saying, I think the problems of poverty, the problems of capitalism force us in a socialist direction, but I look at where socialism leads and I see that it leads to something horrible. And he simply despairs of any solution. Other critics, however, have interpreted the book differently. Richard Rees, for example, writes, obviously it was just because he believed the issues were still undecided that he thought it worthwhile to write these terrible warnings. What's the point of warning people about this, after all, if you think it's inevitable that we're going to end up in a society like 1984? Well, it might be that you simply think that the embrace of socialism inherently leads you there, and so it's a warning not so much against a totalitarian form of socialism, but against socialism itself. I think Orwell doesn't intend it that way. He hopes that there is a solution, that there is a way of addressing problems of inequality and poverty without falling into totalitarianism. But he isn't convinced. I don't think he is either engulfed in despair here, but nor is he hopeful in pointing a way out. Instead, he's pointing out a grave danger, and he doesn't really see how to avoid it. In a passage in 1984, he writes, in each variant of socialism that appeared from about 1900 onwards, the aim of establishing liberty and equality was more and more openly abandoned. The new movements which appeared in the middle years of the century, Ingsoc in Oceania, Neo-Bolshevism in Eurasia, death worship as it's commonly called in East Asia, had the conscious aim of perpetuating unfreedom and inequality. And so the irony is that even though socialism is marketed as a path to freedom, equality, and dignity, it undermines all those things. It leads to a situation where a small elite actually has all the power, has all the wealth, has all the control, and reserves dignity for itself. Everyone else is consigned to an undignified and unfree existence of poverty and ugliness. Ingsoc, after all, which grew out of the earlier socialist movement and inherited its phraseology, has in fact carried out the main item in the socialist program, with the result foreseen and intended beforehand that economic inequality has been made permanent. Ingsoc, in the book, actually makes inequality permanent. It makes dignity something that only the few can manage to preserve, and it's not clear that even they preserve it. One has the strong sense that they're deceiving themselves. They seek power for its own sake, but is that truly a dignified existence? They don't seem to have actually much self-respect. They may have a lot of self-esteem, as O'Brien does, but it's hard to describe those characters as filled with self-respect. Instead, they seem like thugs, deceptive thugs, thugs who really lack basic human decency. Socialists tend to be concerned about class struggle and the class structure of society. That's described too in 1984. The aim of the high class is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all men shall be equal. Well, in the past, the middle had made revolutions under the banner of equality, and then it established a fresh tyranny as soon as the old one was overthrown. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The new middle groups, in effect, proclaimed their tyranny beforehand. Winston Smith finds himself thinking, if there's any hope, it lay in the proles. Only the proletarians, only those of the lower classes, managed to escape that tyrannical mindset. Now, most of the time, they're just thinking about how to survive. They're not really thinking about larger issues at all. But if they do, then perhaps they are free from the kind of tyrannical thinking, the kind of thinking that leads people into this trap of socialist totalitarianism, that leads them to deny freedom, that leads them away from the goal of equality, that leads them to disregard basic human dignity and decency. Orwell himself, in an interview shortly before he died, did talk about what he was trying to do in 1984. He wrote, "My goal is to indicate by parodying them the intellectual implications of totalitarianism. I believe also that totalitarian ideas have taken root in the minds of intellectuals everywhere. I've tried to draw these ideas out to their logical consequences." Orwell looks around himself and sees intellectuals, highly educated people, highly intelligent people, falling into the totalitarian trap, embracing totalitarian ideas and acting as if they're novel, they're avant-garde, they're exciting, they're something that leads toward human freedom, toward equality, toward dignity for all. And he sees that they don't lead in that direction at all. They lead in the opposite direction. Intellectuals, he sees, are leading people, leading everyone really, the entire society, to a future that is like the future in 1984. They support, and indeed all the smart people, all the intelligent people, support a set of ideas that are ultimately oppressive. Some people, especially perhaps the elite, tend to read 1984 and completely miss the point, misread this, think somehow he's warning against something else and not the ideas they themselves hold. Perhaps the most bizarre misreading I've seen is that offered by Hillary Clinton. Look at this. Attempting to define reality is a core feature of authoritarianism, she said. This is what the Soviets did when they erased political dissidents from historical photos. This is what happens in George Orwell's classic novel 1984, when a torturer holds up 4 fingers and delivers electric shocks until his prisoner sees 5 fingers as ordered. The goal is to make you question logic and reason, and to sow mistrust toward exactly the people we need to rely on, our leaders, the press, experts who seek to guide public policy based on evidence, ourselves. Only a member of the elite could think that, in urging us to trust ourselves, Orwell is thereby urging us to trust experts, leaders, and the press. That's certainly not the message. The press, the leaders, the experts in 1984 are people like O'Brien. They aren't people like Winston Smith. And so it is a strange tendency of intellectuals to embrace ideas thinking that they lead in one direction, when in fact they lead in a very different and ultimately totalitarian direction. I want to close with a final thought, a thought that I think is motivated by Orwell's stress on remaining involved in the world. To the extent that we focus on abstractions, that we ignore the real problems of real people, we're going to be tempted to embrace ideas that in fact harm those people, that make them less free, that make them less equal, that deny them dignity. So what we have to do is remain engaged. But in the process of remaining engaged, we're going to end up with dirty hands. We can't keep ourselves pure. And so sometimes it is the very attempt to be ethical, to keep ourselves pure, to embrace ideas we view as ethically pure, that lead us in an ideological direction, leading us to ignore real people, real problems, and real outcomes. So he says we've got to be very careful of that tendency. Intellectuals tend to get so interested in the abstractions, they forget about the concrete problems of real people, and they embrace ideas that end up having terrible consequences. We've got to avoid that, and that means we have to admit that sometimes we're going to make mistakes. Sometimes we're going to do the wrong thing. Sometimes we may even do evil things. But at least if we stay engaged and we pay attention to the real consequences for real people, we can make adjustments and try to do better. So he writes, underneath pacifism, for example, lies the hard fact, so difficult for many people to face, that individual salvation is not possible, that the choice before human beings is not as a rule between good and evil, but between two evils. You can let the Nazis rule the world. That's evil. Or you can overthrow them by war, which is also evil. There is no other choice before you. Whichever you choose, you will not come out with clean hands. It seems to me that the text for our time is not woe to him through whom the evil cometh, but the one from which I took the title of this very article. There is not one that is righteous. No, not one. That theme, that really in the end no one is fully righteous. We do the best we can, but sometimes our choices are inevitably between two things that are wrong, two things that are bad, two things that have terrible consequences. Nazism has terrible consequences, but so does war. And sometimes you simply have to make a choice between two things. Those choices are difficult. We take a moral risk every time we face one. But we can't avoid them. There is no ideological path to purity and safety from a moral point of view. We have to engage in the world and make those hard choices in real-life situations. Sometimes we're going to get it wrong. Sometimes we're going to get it right, but the consequences are still bad in various ways. Fighting a war against true evil may be the best thing to do, but it still engages us in evil. It leads us to do some pretty terrible things. So Orwell's point is that we can't maintain moral purity, and that our salvation isn't ultimately individual. It consists in working together and remaining engaged together to try to solve real human problems, to try to protect freedom, equality, and dignity as best we can.